It was supposed to be just another day in court routine, quiet, predictable. But when a power-hungry deputy puts his hands on the wrong black woman, everything changes. What he doesn't know is that she's not just a witness. She's the force sent to dismantle the very system he thought would protect him. What follows is a 4-minute unraveling of arrogance, abuse, and unshakable justice. You think you've seen courtroom drama? Not like this. Stay with us, because once it starts, there's no looking away. And before we dive in, drop a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and what time you hit play. We love hearing from each and every one of you. The courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, hadn't changed much in over a century. The grand columns out front still stood proudly, as if untouched by time, and inside, the floors gleamed with old marble, polished down by the weight of decades of justice and injustice. Portraits of judges and generals from another era still hung high on the walls, some in faded black and white, some in color, all of them white men in heavy coats, staring down with solemn eyes. It was the kind of place where silence felt sacred and heavy, and where tradition wasn't questioned, it was obeyed. Dr. Monique Harris pulled open the heavy courthouse door with a calm resolve. Her low heels echoed across the tile as she entered, the kind of confident sound that turns heads without needing to raise a voice. She was dressed professionally, charcoal blazer, cream blouse, and navy slacks, but more than that, she carried herself like someone who didn't shrink in the face of confrontation. She had learned that long ago, working with trauma survivors, war veterans, and even some law enforcement officers who had seen too much. As a clinical psychologist, she'd been called in by the prosecution as an expert witness to testify in a high-profile case, one involving an alleged pattern of abuse and excessive force by officers in the Richmond Police Department. She had done this sort of thing before. She knew how courtrooms worked, but what she didn't expect was the man standing just inside the courtroom doors. A white deputy in a beige uniform, arms folded tight, jaw locked, eyes like stone. His nameplate read R. Denning, and even before he opened his mouth, she felt the subtle tension, the air going just slightly stiller. "You can't go in there," he said, voice cold and clipped. Monique looked him square in the eye, unbothered. "I'm expected," she replied. "I'm Dr. Harris. I'm testifying this morning on behalf of the prosecution." Denning didn't move. His fingers tapped lightly against the butt of the taser on his belt. "You got ID." She reached into her bag and handed him her state-issued credentials and court summons. He barely glanced at them before shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. Can't let you in just yet." "Is there a reason?" she asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. "You people always find a way to make things difficult," he muttered under his breath. Monique blinked. "Excuse me?" Denning leaned in just a little. "You heard me. There was no one else in the hallway just yet. The morning docket hadn't fully started, and the media was still setting up outside." Monique knew better than to argue in circles. She stepped to the side, prepared to call the lead prosecutor to clarify, when Denning suddenly moved. In one swift motion too fast to be rational, too aggressive to be accidental, he kicked her. Hard. His boot landed square in her side, knocking the wind out of her and sending her staggering sideways into the wood-paneled wall. The pain flared immediately, deep and sharp. She hit the ground with a thud, her breath caught in her throat, her palms scraping against the tile. For a moment, time stopped. Then the silence broke. A couple of public defenders standing by the water cooler looked up, startled. A court clerk on her way in paused, eyes wide. But no one moved. No one stepped forward. The courtroom doors remained closed. The security cameras above the hallway blinked a steady red, recording everything and doing nothing. Denning stood there, unmoved. "You should have listened," he said quietly, almost like he was trying to convince himself more than her. Monique didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she forced herself up, slow but steady. Her ribs ached with every breath, but she made it to her feet, brushing off her slacks with trembling fingers. Her eyes never left his face. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. A thin stream of air hissed through her teeth as she drew in a breath. The moment had turned surreal. This was a courthouse, the supposed house of law and order. And yet, here she was assaulted before even stepping through the door to do her job, by a man who was supposed to uphold the very system she was trying to assist. More people were entering now. A young woman with a notepad, a court reporter, froze mid-step when she saw Monique standing, bruised, barely steady. A low murmur began to spread, like ripples across water. People started asking questions in hushed tones. What happened? Did she fall? Was that the deputy? Denning, for his part, looked calm. Too calm. His smirk was faint, but it was there. He believed he'd gotten away with it. He thought no one would care. He thought maybe she'd just walk away like so many others before her probably had. But Monique didn't move. Not yet. She adjusted her blazer, took another breath, and straightened to her full height. Her gaze locked on his again. It was in that moment right there that something shifted. Not just in the hallway, in the building, in the air. Denning's arrogance hadn't accounted for who she really was. And while the crowd still whispered and watched from the corners of the hall, Monique knew something he didn't. He had made a mistake, and in less than 4 minutes, he would understand exactly how big of one. For a few long seconds, no one said a word. The air in the hallway outside the courtroom hung heavy with disbelief, like the calm before a storm that no one wanted to admit was coming. The slap of Deputy Denning's boot against Monique's side still echoed in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The courthouse, always a place of measured steps and hushed tones, now buzzed with a quiet kind of panic, a restrained chaos hiding behind wide eyes and stiff shoulders. Some people turned away, pretending not to have seen. Others lingered awkwardly nearby, watching but saying nothing, their faces twisted with a strange mix of curiosity and fear. A few looked at Denning, then at Monique, trying to read the situation, trying to figure out who they were supposed to believe. One man in a cheap gray suit, likely a defense attorney, leaned toward another and whispered, "Maybe she provoked him." "I don't know," the other replied under his breath. "He's got a temper, but it's her word against his." Denning still stood by the door, his posture relaxed, almost smug. His arms were crossed, and his expression was that of a man who had done this before and gotten away with it every time. If anything, he seemed annoyed that anyone was making a big deal out of it. He let out a low chuckle, barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You all act like she didn't have it coming," he muttered to no one in particular, loud enough for just a few to hear. The words didn't need to be loud to leave a mark. Monique, still regaining her breath, kept her gaze locked on him. Her side throbbed, her pride bruised, but her spirit untouched. She'd seen this exact posture before, in interrogation rooms, in therapy sessions, even in her own childhood. That same smirk, that same quiet belief that power would protect him. But not this time. A young intern, maybe barely out of college, walked by holding a case file. She stopped mid-step when she saw Monique, her eyes darting from the bruises forming on her blouse to the deputy standing nearby. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She quickly looked down and kept walking. People didn't know what to do, and Denning counted on that. Most wouldn't speak up. Most wouldn't challenge a badge, especially not here, in this building, in this city. The rules were unwritten but well understood. Denning didn't need to scream or shove or pull a weapon. A single kick and a dirty look was all it took to silence a hallway. But not her. Monique pushed herself upright, ignoring the pain that pulsed through her ribs with every breath. She smoothed down her blazer, straightened her shoulders, and scanned the hallway. The fear was still there. Yes, but underneath it, something else began to flicker in the faces of those around her. Doubt. Not in her, but in him. A man in a dark green suit, clearly a federal attorney, stepped out of the elevator and glanced around. His eyes landed on Monique. Recognition flashed across his face. "Doctor Harris?" he asked, hurrying toward her. Denning tensed, just for a second. She nodded. Yes. Are you all right? The man asked, eyes already narrowing as he looked between her and Denning. I will be, she said calmly. Thank you for asking. The attorney opened his mouth to ask more questions, but Monique gently raised her hand. Give me just a moment, she said. Then, turning slowly back to Denning, she walked deliberately, steadily until they were just a few feet apart. Her voice when it came was soft, controlled, dangerous in its stillness. You really don't know who I am, do you? Denning snorted. Don't care either. You can throw doctor titles around all you want. That won't save you from being out of line. The hallway fell quiet again. Even those who had looked away earlier were now watching with full attention. Monique leaned in just a little. I'm not here as a therapist. I'm not here as a random citizen. I'm here as the Department of Justice's lead investigator on this case, your department's case. The effect was immediate. Like someone had knocked all the air out of the room. People blinked. Someone in the back gasped audibly. Even Denning's smirk faltered barely, but enough. Monique didn't flinch. She looked him square in the eye and added, And trust me, everything that just happened here is going in my report. A ripple of movement shot through the hallway as people instinctively took a step back. The tide was turning. For the first time in his career, Denning looked unsure. 4 minutes hadn't passed yet, but his karma had already begun to arrive. Monique didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, didn't reach for her phone. She didn't need to. The weight of her words had already begun to shift the air around her. Her calm was unsettling, especially to Denning, whose smirk had hardened into something colder, more confused. That smug certainty was starting to show cracks. He shifted his stance, crossed his arms tighter across his chest, said nothing. You really don't know who I am, Monique repeated, quieter this time, but with unmistakable edge. The hallway had gone still again, not with fear now, but with anticipation. People leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Someone near the corner whispered, Did she say DOJ? Denning scoffed and looked away. You got a big mouth for someone who got herself kicked on the floor. A few people actually gasped at that. There were lines even in a courthouse, and he'd just tripped over one in broad daylight. Monique didn't take the bait. She just took a step forward, brushing a small crease from her sleeve like she was preparing to give a lecture. I wasn't going to say anything, she said. I came here quietly. I was here to testify. You were nothing but a name in my file. But now, she tilted her head just slightly. Now you're in the first paragraph of my report. Denning's jaw tightened. You don't believe me, she said flatly. That's fine. You'll find out soon enough. He tried to push past it. You think throwing around government titles is going to scare me? I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. That might be true, she said, smiling now. But I've been watching you since before you even knew this investigation existed. Every complaint, every cover-up, every person too scared to speak. I know the difference between a bad day and a dangerous pattern. You, Deputy Denning, are the pattern. Behind her, someone murmured, Oh my God. That was the thing about moments like this. They start quiet, then they shift, then they roar. The door to courtroom 3 swung open with a loud creak, and several attorneys walked out, including the lead prosecutor, a tall, lean black man in his late 50s, named Charles Albright. He had known Monique for years, worked with her in multiple cities, and respected her like few others in his field. His eyes scanned the hallway until he saw her. Doctor Harris, he said with urgency, walking toward her. Then he paused. What happened? She was attacked, said the federal attorney who had arrived moments earlier. Albright's face changed immediately. By who? No one needed to answer. He looked straight at Denning. Denning stood there, trying to look composed, but his grip on his belt had gotten tighter. Monique stayed calm. Deputy Denning prevented me from entering the courtroom, used excessive force, and verbally harassed me. Albright's tone turned lethal. He what? 4 minutes ago, she said, turning her wrist to glance at her watch. He put his boot into my side. I was trying to enter to give sworn expert testimony. Albright turned toward the closest court officer. Get the judge. Now. Things were unraveling fast now. Denning's confidence was draining visibly. He turned to a colleague nearby, a younger officer in uniform, maybe early 30s. She's lying, Denning said quickly. She's just trying to blow this up. The younger officer hesitated. He looked at Monique, then at the other attorney, then back at Denning. You could see it on his face. He didn't want to get involved, but he knew the truth mattered. I saw the kick, the officer said quietly. It happened. Denning looked like he'd been slapped. Monique didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Another door opened. This time, 2 U.S. Marshals entered the hall, walking briskly toward the group. Their badges glinted under the fluorescent lights. The taller of the two, a Latino man with a crisp navy jacket, stepped forward. Doctor. Monique Harris? He asked. Yes. We've been informed of an incident. We're here on behalf of the Justice Department. Monique nodded. Thank you. I'd like this matter documented fully. The marshal turned to Denning. Sir, we need you to step aside immediately. Denning blinked. I didn't do anything wrong. She's making a scene. Look at her, she's putting on a show. The shorter marshal, a black woman in her 40s with braided hair and eyes that didn't miss a thing, stepped in. We're going to sort this out, but you're not staying on duty while we do. He was cornered. For the first time in that courthouse, in his career maybe, Denning had no allies in the room. Just silence. Just eyes. Monique finally let out a breath. Not of relief. Not yet, but of control. Because now, the real story had begun, and the man who once laughed at her on the floor would soon be answering questions she was trained to ask. The seconds ticked by like thunderclaps. Deputy Denning stood stiff as stone while the marshals faced him squarely. The younger one, the black woman with steely eyes, moved first. We're placing you on administrative hold, effective immediately, she said. You are not under arrest at this time, but you are required to step away from your duties and comply with the investigation now underway. Denning stared back, mouth slightly open, caught somewhere between defiance and disbelief. You can't be serious. This is political. She's lying. She's trying to destroy my career over a misunderstanding. But nobody was buying it anymore, not even his fellow officers. In the last few minutes, a few more courtroom staff had gathered in the hallway. Word had already begun to spread. Someone had texted a local reporter, who happened to be seated just down the corridor. Another had quietly slipped into the adjacent courtroom to let the judge know what had happened. The silent machine of accountability so often delayed, so often ignored, was finally moving, and fast. Monique hadn't moved far. She stood beside the federal attorney who had originally greeted her, her posture composed, but her eyes sharp and watching. She didn't smile. This wasn't a victory, not yet. It was merely the beginning of a truth surfacing. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead. Denning took a half step back, still clutching his belt, and for the first time he looked smaller, like the uniform didn't fit him the same anymore. One of the courtroom doors opened again, and Judge Elaine Weatherby stepped out, a woman in her early 70s with white curls and a face like carved granite. She had presided over civil rights cases for decades, and she had no patience for messes inside her house. She spotted Monique first, then Denning, and then the marshals. "What in the hell is going on in my hallway?" she demanded. The courtroom went dead silent. The younger marshal spoke up, keeping her tone steady. "Your Honor, this woman doctor, Monique Harris, was physically assaulted by Deputy Denning while attempting to enter the courtroom to provide expert testimony. She is also the lead federal investigator on the case in your docket." Judge Weatherby's eyes narrowed to slits. "Is this true?" she asked Monique directly. Monique nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He kicked me without provocation, refused to let me enter. He used a racial slur and then tried to laugh it off. Denning started to protest. That's not—" "Be quiet," Weatherby snapped. "You'll speak when I say." The judge turned her eyes toward Denning with a fury that could cut steel. "Do you have any idea who you just laid hands on? Do you know how deep of a hole you've dug for yourself, deputy?" Denning, still struggling to regain control, shook his head. "She came in here like she owned the place." "She does, in a way," Weatherby said coolly. "She has more authority in this courthouse right now than you ever will again." Then she turned to the marshal. "Escort him to a separate holding room and restrict his access to any court function until further notice." "Yes, Your Honor." The two marshals moved forward, one stepping in front of Denning, while the other motioned for him to follow. He resisted just slightly, his voice rising. "This is wrong. I've been with this department 23 years. I've taken down real criminals, drug dealers, gang members. I've bled in this job. And now you've bled your credibility," the judge said. "Congratulations." As the marshals led Denning away, a strange hush fell over the corridor, not out of reverence, but disbelief. No one had ever seen it happen like this before. No drama, no shouting, just justice rolling in like a slow-moving train and running straight over a man who thought he was untouchable. Once Denning was out of sight, Judge Weatherby turned back to Monique. "Are you okay?" she asked, and for the first time, her voice softened. "I'm fine," Monique said. "I've had worse. But thank you. I'd like you to take a few minutes before entering the courtroom," Weatherby said. "There will be no delays in your testimony, but you're entitled to a moment to catch your breath. And I'd like the court physician to check you for any injury." "I'll allow it," Monique nodded. "But I'll be on that witness stand in 10 minutes. The judge almost smiled. Almost. She turned and walked back into her courtroom, but not before giving instructions to her bailiff to bar Denning from all future court proceedings. Monique stepped into a small waiting room off the main corridor. The moment the door closed behind her, she allowed herself to exhale deeply, slowly. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was beginning to fade, and with it came the sharp reminder in her ribs that she had, indeed, been kicked. She gently pressed against her side, wincing. Nothing broken. Bruised, certainly. The court physician arrived a few moments later, a thin man in glasses with a kind touch and quiet words. He confirmed it no fractures, but substantial bruising, and he suggested she apply ice and rest later that evening. She thanked him, stood again, and fixed her hair in the mirror. 10 minutes. That's all she had to process what had just happened before stepping into a courtroom full of strangers to deliver expert testimony against a system that had protected men like Denning for years. But she wasn't afraid of the system. She was part of the change now. As she opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, several people turned to look at her again, but this time, their faces weren't skeptical or distant. They were with her. And Denning? He was no longer in the building. In 4 minutes, he had gone from smug gatekeeper to a man escorted out in disgrace. 4 minutes was all it took to unravel 2 decades of unearned power. 4 minutes was all it took for karma to come knocking. Monique adjusted the waistband of her slacks and walked back toward courtroom 3, her shoulders square, her steps steady. The ache in her ribs reminded her of the kick, but the silence in the hall, the respectful, almost reverent quiet reminded her of something else, power shifting. There was no more whispering now. No nervous glances, no trying to guess who was right or wrong. People had seen. They had watched a woman get kicked to the ground, and then watched her rise with more dignity than the man who wore the badge. As Monique neared the double doors to the courtroom, someone moved to open it for her. It was a young woman, probably a clerk or assistant, who had been standing silently nearby during the confrontation. She looked like she wanted to say something, maybe an apology that wasn't hers to give, but Monique simply nodded and stepped past her. Inside the courtroom, it was warm, lit by soft, fluorescent lights overhead. A judge's bench towered above the polished wood floor, flanked by flags and law books, and filled with the quiet buzz of professionals preparing for a hearing that had now taken on an entirely new weight. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and observers turned to look as Monique entered. Every eye followed her. Charles Albright, the lead prosecutor, stood and gave her a small nod of respect as she took the witness stand. As she sat, someone brought her a glass of water. The Judge Weatherby didn't waste time. "We are back on the record," she said, voice commanding. "Let the transcript reflect that Dr. Monique Harris has returned to the courtroom and that Deputy Ralph Denning has been removed from his post and placed under federal review." Gasps rippled through the back row where local journalists had gathered. The defense attorney stood slowly, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, I request a recess to confer with my client. This new development regarding the officer may affect our arguments." "Denied," Judge Weatherby said flatly. "Dr. Harris will proceed with her testimony. You can catch up later." Monique opened her folder slowly, flipping past the pages she had already memorized. But before she began, she lifted her head and addressed the room, not with arrogance, but with calm certainty. "What just happened in the hallway," she said, "isn't an isolated incident. What you saw is part of a long and well-documented pattern of behavior. The reason I'm here isn't only to speak on statistics or charts or trauma theory. I'm here because the systems we've built have allowed this kind of behavior to fester without consequence." She let the words settle. No one moved, no one objected. She continued, "In my investigation, I've reviewed over 50 internal complaints spanning 10 years. I've interviewed former officers, community members, medical professionals, and family members of individuals who suffered abuse or neglect during interactions with this department. The names change, the uniforms change, but the stories, they're alarmingly similar." As she spoke, the stenographer's keys clacked steadily. A few jurors leaned forward. Even the defense attorney didn't interrupt. Monique remained poised, hands resting calmly on the edge of the stand. Deputy Denning's actions today, captured on courthouse surveillance and witnessed by no less than 4 individuals, are not the beginning of a story. They're the result of a story that's been building for years. This isn't personal vengeance. It's accountability. She paused, and for a moment, the entire room felt like it was holding its breath. Then the judge leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on one hand. "You may proceed with the evidence, Dr. Harris." Monique clicked her laptop and projected a series of charts on the courtroom screen: patterns of excessive force complaints, racial disparities in arrests, and the timeline of unresolved misconduct investigations within the Richmond Police Department. Every figure had a name behind it. Every case file was someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's neighbor. The courtroom listened, not because they had to, but because no one could look away. When her testimony concluded nearly 45 minutes later, there was a beat of silence before the judge spoke again. "Thank you, Dr. Harris. Your contribution to this case is invaluable." Monique nodded once and stepped down. As she made her way to the back of the room, a journalist handed her a folded note. It was scribbled on a torn page from a reporter's notebook. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier. Thank you for standing up for all of us." She didn't know who A was, but she folded the note carefully and slipped it into her case folder. Back in the hallway, Denning was gone, but the consequences of his actions were only just beginning. Outside, a small crowd had formed near the courthouse steps. News vans were parked across the street, and the story had already begun to break online. Monique's name was trending regionally. Cell phone videos of the aftermath, her calm voice, the marshals removing Denning. The moment the judge spoke up were being shared by the minute. Inside the courthouse, a young assistant Da caught up to her as she gathered her things. "They just opened a federal inquiry into Denning's full personnel file," she whispered. "Internal Affairs is cooperating. DOJ already sent a second team." Monique nodded. She had expected it, but the speed still caught her off guard. Also, the assistant added, "The mayor's office just released a statement. They're publicly distancing themselves from the department's leadership. There's going to be heat." "There should be," Monique replied, adjusting the strap on her laptop bag. "There should have been years ago." She walked out into the late morning light, the courthouse behind her, and a sea of possibility ahead. Some people recognized her and clapped quietly. Others simply stepped aside to let her pass. There was no parade, no cheers, just the quiet kind of recognition that lingers when the truth finally gets a name and a face. She wasn't there to be famous. She was there to do her job. But if someone like Denning thought a single kick could erase her purpose, he had grossly miscalculated the moment and the woman. News travels fast in small cities, but when that news involves a federal investigator being assaulted by a sheriff's deputy inside a courthouse, it spreads like wildfire. By the time Monique stepped out of the building and into the bright Virginia sun, the atmosphere outside had completely changed. Local news crews had set up tripods on the sidewalk. Cameramen were already filming live, narrating with hurried voices. Microphones thrust toward anyone who would talk. Protesters had begun arriving, holding handwritten signs reading "Justice for All," and we saw the kick. No one needed to be told what happened. They had seen enough. Monique kept her head high. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't wave. She walked down the courthouse steps with the same grace and self-possession she had carried into the courtroom. But inside, she felt the weight of everything pressing down at once. This wasn't just about Denning anymore. It was about an entire system, exposed at the worst possible moment, and now the entire city was watching to see what came next. Back inside the courthouse, the fallout had already begun. Within the hour, the Richmond Police Department issued a brief statement saying Deputy Denning had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a federal investigation. But the wording was careful, vague, full of the kind of legal padding that tried to offer distance without blame. It didn't work. Reporters immediately began digging into Denning's record, and what they found made everything worse. 14 previous complaints, 2 internal affairs reviews closed without action, body cam footage mysteriously lost or inconclusive. And in one case, a quiet civil settlement the city paid out to a young black man who had been injured during a traffic stop gone wrong. The timeline painted a picture of a man protected by silence. Until now. At the precinct, officers were shaken. Some defended him, saying he was old school, a tough guy doing a tough job. But others admitted, quietly, that they'd seen his temper. They knew he crossed lines. And after watching the video footage, grainy courthouse security paired with cell phone clips, it became harder to excuse. He hadn't just kicked someone, he'd kicked the wrong someone, and the city was about to pay the price. By mid-afternoon, the mayor called a press conference. She stood stiffly at a podium, flanked by aides and flustered police leadership. Her face was pale, voice clipped. "This morning's events at the Richmond courthouse are deeply troubling," she began. "We are cooperating fully with the Department of Justice, and we will take appropriate action pending the results of the investigation." Monique watched the speech from a quiet office inside the DOJ's local field office, where she had gone to meet with her team. Her ribs still ached, and she hadn't yet had time to eat, but adrenaline kept her moving. She sipped slowly on a bottle of water and studied the screen as the mayor tried to dance between outrage and damage control. Her phone vibrated. A text from her lead assistant investigator. "We're greenlit. Pulling Denning's full personnel file from IA. There's more." She already knew what that meant. Patterns. Patterns of abuse, of cover-ups, of supervisors who signed off on incident reports without ever reading them. Richmond wasn't unique, but now it was exposed. The most ironic part? None of this would have happened today if Denning had simply followed procedure and let her through the door. She would have testified, presented her findings, and walked away quietly. But he'd made a different choice, and in doing so, he'd fast-tracked his own reckoning. Back at the courthouse, Judge Weatherby had issued an emergency order to unseal several previous complaints filed against Denning, citing public interest and compelling evidence. Journalists were poring over case numbers, matching names to closed reports, building timelines that went back more than a decade. And then came the story that broke everything open. A former officer retired just 6 months prior came forward on the record. I watched him slam a kid's face into a patrol car back in 2019, the man said, his voice gravelly from years of silence. Wrote the report up myself. Told the captain. They told me not to push it. Bad optics, they said. Now it was more than optics. It was exposure. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended nationally. Justice in Richmond. Hashtag, we saw the kick. Hashtag, stand with Monique. The governor's office released a statement praising her courage and calling for a comprehensive review of law enforcement training and disciplinary procedures statewide. A special session was scheduled within 48 hours, all because one woman stood up in a courthouse and refused to be silenced. Monique turned off the news feed and stood at the window overlooking downtown Richmond. She could see the protest forming below, people carrying signs, chanting not in rage but in unity. Something had shifted, not entirely and not forever, but enough. Behind her, her assistant investigator entered the room. "You ready for the 4 p.m. meeting?" he asked. She nodded. "Let's make sure we use this momentum wisely. Today's just the start." He handed her a folder. "You'll want to see this." Inside were photocopies of Denning's disciplinary reports. She recognized 2 names, immediately victims whose complaints had been dismissed years earlier due to insufficient evidence. Now, their cases were being reopened. Monique closed the file slowly. Denning's kick had been more than an attack, it had been a confession. Not in words, but in arrogance. He had believed that the rules didn't apply to him, that no one would care, that a black woman in a courthouse wouldn't fight back. But he had underestimated everything, her experience, her resilience, her purpose. Outside, the chants grew louder. A young boy on someone's shoulders held a sign that read, "We believe her," and for the first time that day, Monique smiled. Karma wasn't always fast, but when it came, it didn't knock. It kicked the damn door down. The interrogation room wasn't meant for people like Ralph Denning. At least, that's what he believed. It was cold. Bare walls, no windows, a metal table bolted to the ground, and a single chair that creaked whenever he shifted his weight. He sat hunched over, hands clenched together on the tabletop, his knuckles white. His badge had already been taken. His weapon, too. The marshals didn't handcuff him yet, but the room made its own statement. "You're not in control anymore." Across from him sat 2 federal agents, one in a crisp black suit, the other in rolled-up sleeves and quiet eyes that had seen too much. Neither looked impressed. Neither offered small talk. They had a manila folder thicker than a Bible, and every page inside it was about Ralph Denning. So, the first agent began, his voice neutral but deliberate. "Before we go any further, is there anything you'd like to say about this morning?" Denning shifted. "It was a misunderstanding," he muttered. "She tried to push past me. I reacted. Instinct." The agent raised an eyebrow. "Instinct?" "Yeah," Denning said. "She got too close. Disrespectful. Aggressive." The second agent slid a printed photo across the table. It was a still from the courthouse camera. Monique, standing calmly. Denning, mid-kick. Her hands were at her sides. No sign of aggression. "You want to explain what's aggressive about this?" Denning stared at it, his face flushed. I thought she was someone else. She showed you her ID. I didn't get a good look at it." The first agent leaned forward. "Deputy Denning, we have 14 official complaints linked to your personnel file." 14. "We have 3 signed affidavits from witnesses this morning. We have a growing number of victims coming forward. We also have a federal investigator, Dr. Harris, who you physically assaulted in a courthouse. Do you understand what that means?" Denning didn't answer. His shoulders sagged. The agent opened the folder. "Let's talk about July 2017. Traffic stop on Jefferson Street. You pulled over a black man named Jerome Kelly. There's no body cam footage on file." "It was broken," Denning said quickly. "The same excuse you gave in March 2018, the agent replied, flipping pages. "And October 2019. And February 2021. Denning swallowed hard. "Look, that department has problems, but they always sent me out because I got results." The second agent shook his head. Results or silence? Denning stayed quiet. The folder closed with a quiet but final thud. The sound felt heavier than it should have. The agent nodded once and stood. We'll be forwarding all of this to the Point Use Attorney's office. For now, you're on full suspension. You're not going back to your job. Not ever. Denning barely heard the last part. He was already staring down at his own reflection in the stainless steel tabletop, seeing a future crumble right in front of him. Upstairs in the DOJ conference room, Monique was going over the bigger picture. Charts, timelines, case reviews, everything was laid out on the long walnut table. Her assistant investigators and 2 DOJ analysts had joined the effort, each with stacks of notes and digital files pulled from precinct servers. It's a domino effect, one of them said. Everywhere we look, Denning's name shows up like mold interviews, incident reports, unsworn statements that were never followed up. Monique nodded. He was a symptom. Now we need to diagnose the system. They worked methodically, connecting case files with data, identifying clusters of misconduct that had gone uninvestigated. Patterns emerged. Whole neighborhoods over-policed. Families who had given up filing complaints because nothing ever changed. Then a folder was dropped in front of Monique, labeled Priority, Confidential. An anonymous tip came in this afternoon, her assistant said. It's a scanned copy of a handwritten memo. Looks like a lieutenant in internal affairs. Flagged Denning 4 years ago as a liability. Said he should have been fired. The memo was ignored. Monique opened it. Read the paragraph. Read it again. It was signed, dated, marked received, buried. She closed her eyes and exhaled. This wasn't just bad policing. It was willful neglect. And someone was going to answer for it. Later that evening, Monique sat at her hotel desk, surrounded by printed files and an untouched sandwich. Her ribs still ached. Her inbox buzzed constantly requests for interviews, support emails from survivors, messages from colleagues across the country saying, finally, she answered none of them. Instead, she opened her notes and started writing her final report. The first line came easily. This was not an isolated incident. The rest would be facts, patterns, proof. But it would begin with truth. Truth that too many people had tried to bury. Truth that got kicked down hallways and laughed off by men in uniform. Truth that refused to stay quiet anymore. Monique paused only when she heard the knock. She opened the door to find Charles Albright, the prosecutor. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" he asked. "Sure." He stepped inside, looking more tired than usual, but also deeply resolved. "I just got word," he said. "We're officially opening a criminal case against Denning. Federal charges. Civil rights violations. Obstruction. Assault." Monique nodded once. No joy, no triumph, just necessary closure. "And," Charles continued, "we're expanding the scope of the inquiry to include the top 3 commanders in his chain of command. Anyone who protected him." She met his eyes. "It's about time." "You did that," he said. "You started this." She shook her head. "No, he did. The moment he thought kicking me would keep me quiet, that's when he gave this story a voice." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the streets were quieter now, but the pressure hadn't lifted. It had only begun. Before Charles left, he stopped at the door. "By the way," he said, "my mother called me this morning. She watched the courthouse footage. She's 78. She told me, 'Don't let that woman fight alone.'" Monique smiled for the first time in hours. "Tell her I said thank you." After he left, she returned to her report. The words flowed faster now. There was still so much work to do. But for once, it felt like the wall was cracking, and the truth was finally getting through. By morning, the town wasn't the same. Richmond, once a city used to quiet cover-ups and whispered apologies behind closed doors, had finally opened its eyes. Local headlines screamed across breakfast tables. DOJ investigator, assaulted at courthouse and sheriff's deputy, suspended pending federal charges. News vans still lined the street outside the courthouse. and more than a dozen protesters had camped overnight with handmade signs demanding accountability. Monique sat inside a modest office at the DOJ field headquarters, going over transcripts from victims who were just now brave enough to speak. One of them was a middle-aged black man who had never filed a formal complaint, fearing retaliation. He showed up unannounced that morning with his teenage daughter. "I heard what happened to you," he told Monique. "I saw the video. I want my story on record now, finally. Because if they came after someone like you, I know I wasn't crazy all those years ago." She took his statement personally, typed every word herself. Because that's how real change happens, one voice at a time, until the volume is impossible to ignore. Outside, the streets were waking up. Church groups had started organizing. Community leaders, once cautious, were now calling press conferences. Teachers, nurses, retirees, all marching in quiet defiance. The signs weren't angry. They were resolved. Enough is enough. We stand with Monique. Reform now. In the midst of it all, Denning was nowhere to be seen. His home, once in a quiet cul-de-sac on the west side, was now flanked by reporters and guarded by local deputies. His wife had left the night before with a single suitcase. His oldest son had disabled his social media accounts. Denning himself hadn't been seen publicly since the marshals walked him out of the courthouse. But inside his house, he was unraveling. He paced in his living room, blinds drawn, the television on low volume repeating the same headline over and over. His phone buzzed constantly, some calls from union reps, others from former colleagues. Most didn't know what to say. Some left voicemails of support. A few just cursed him out. He didn't return any of them. He sat in silence most of the day, replaying that moment in the courthouse in his mind over and over again. How quick it had all gone wrong. How one decision had taken a career he thought was untouchable and dragged it into the mud. He told himself it wasn't his fault, that the media made it worse, that the woman had exaggerated. But deep down, beneath the excuses and the defiance, the truth had already started to set in. He was finished. Back at the DOJ office, Monique reviewed yet another complaint, this one buried deep in an internal affairs report that had been marked inconclusive 5 years prior. It matched Denning's name, matched his signature, and most importantly, matched a testimony from someone now willing to step forward again. This time, the story wouldn't be buried. Monique didn't need cameras or microphones to feel the shift. It was in the tone of people's voices, in the calls from old colleagues who once kept their distance and were now volunteering time and resources. It was in the way the court officers greeted her with quiet respect, not pity. They knew she wasn't a victim. They had seen a warrior walk through that courtroom. The mayor, after days of vague press statements, finally held a public forum that evening. It was a packed community center. People of all ages filled the folding chairs, some standing in the back just to be present. The mayor, dressed in a gray blazer and pearls, stepped up to the podium. Her voice was tense, but steady. "Let me be clear," she said. "This administration will no longer tolerate the culture of silence within our police force. We are cooperating fully with federal oversight, and effective immediately, we will begin reviewing all cases involving use of force over the last 15 years. The crowd murmured in approval. Some clapped. Some didn't trust her yet. But it was a start. In the back of the room, Monique stood quietly with her hands folded. She hadn't come to speak. She'd come to listen. Because this moment wasn't about her. It was about the community finding its voice again. After the meeting, a retired teacher approached her. An older woman with silver braids and soft hands. "I taught first grade for 30 years, she said, "and I always told my students, be brave, even when you're afraid. Thank you for reminding me what that looks like as an adult." Monique smiled. "Thank you for saying that." Meanwhile, Denning sat in his dark kitchen, staring at a stack of unopened mail. His lawyer had told him to keep quiet. His department had told him nothing at all. He was no longer being protected. He was being erased. He walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. For the first time, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The news played in the background. Another protest. Another family speaking out. Another story from a mother who said, "We tried to file complaints for years. Karma wasn't loud. It was relentless. And now it was in his home, at his dinner table, crawling up his spine with every ring of the phone and every headline on the screen." Monique, by contrast, slept that night for the first time in days. Not long, but deep. Because she knew tomorrow there'd be more reports, more testimonies, more systems to dissect. But tonight, the scales had shifted just a little, and in the silence of a city that used to look the other way, something new had begun. A reckoning, a rebalancing. And it had started with a single kick that turned into a movement. 6 weeks later, the courtroom looked very different. It was the same wood-paneled chamber, the same high ceilings and solemn flags flanking the bench, but everything about the energy in the room had changed. The press now filled an entire side section of seats, their cameras respectfully silent, but ever watchful. A dozen community members who had once sworn off court appearances now sat in the front row. Several of them wore black T-shirts with gold letters reading, "We believe her." This wasn't just another trial. This was the reckoning. Ralph Denning sat at the defendant's table, no longer in uniform. Instead, he wore an ill-fitting suit, the kind loaned by a cousin or a public defender. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who had been shrinking by the day. His hair, once buzzed and sharp, had grown uneven. His eyes were tired, dark around the edges. He had lost weight. What hadn't changed was the way he looked around the room, still scanning for allies, for someone who might speak up in his defense. But he found none. Even his attorney, a stiff, overworked man from a small private firm, seemed to distance himself with every objection overruled and motion denied. Judge Weatherby entered, her presence commanding immediate silence. She didn't look at Denning when she sat, didn't smile at the courtroom. Her job was to preside, not to soothe. This court is now in session for the case of the United States versus Ralph Denning, the bailiff announced. The charges were read aloud: federal assault, obstruction of justice, violation of civil rights under color of law. The words hit like drum beats, steady and unrelenting. The courtroom didn't gasp, they already knew. But hearing them spoken in formal terms gave the moment the weight it deserved. Denning didn't look up. The prosecution began, led by Charles Albright. He spoke with clarity and control, laying out a timeline of behavior that had built over years, culminating in the incident witnessed by half a courthouse. For too long, Charles said, this man believed he was above consequences. For too long, our system enabled him. But today, that ends. This courtroom is not just a place of judgment, it's a place of truth. And the truth is, Deputy Denning abused his authority. And when he assaulted a federal investigator in this very building, he crossed a line no badge can shield. The jury listened. The judge nodded once. The defense didn't object. But one person wasn't in the room: Monique. She had chosen not to attend the trial. It wasn't about fear. It wasn't about fatigue. It was about principle. She had done her part. She had submitted her report, given her sworn deposition, handed over every document, interview, and surveillance clip. She had spent hours testifying before a grand jury. But when it came time for the trial, she had chosen to be somewhere else on a quiet road in Mississippi, where another department had just asked for her expertise. There were more systems to fix. She wasn't interested in watching one man's collapse. She was interested in preventing the next one. Still, her name echoed through the courtroom that day like a drumbeat. Dr. Harris said. Dr. Harris submitted. Dr. Harris observed. Even in her absence, she was the backbone of the case. The prosecution played the surveillance footage grainy, but clear. The kick, the collapse, the look on Denning's face. It was followed by the courtroom audio, the moment when Denning had muttered, "You people always make things harder than they have to be." No jury needed interpretation. They watched, they listened, and slowly the image of Denning as a misunderstood officer doing a hard job crumbled before their eyes. The defense tried to pivot, tried to portray him as a man under pressure, a product of a failing system. They leaned on his years of service, his commendations from a decade ago, the danger of his beat. But none of it landed. Because the danger wasn't Denning's job, it was Denning himself. On the final day of the trial, the jury left for deliberation just after lunch. They returned less than 3 hours later. Guilty on all counts. Denning didn't react at first. He sat still, blinking slowly, like the words hadn't quite reached him yet. Then his shoulders slumped, and he turned to his lawyer, who simply exhaled and said nothing. The judge set sentencing for 60 days out, denying bail. In the meantime, Denning was escorted from the courtroom in silence. Outside, reporters called out questions that he didn't answer. Cameras clicked. Protesters didn't cheer. They stood in quiet solidarity, holding signs, some crying. There was no joy in the fall of a man, just relief. Later that night, Charles Albright called Monique. She was sitting on the back porch of a small townhome in Jackson, sipping tea, her laptop beside her. "It's done," he said. "Guilty. All counts." "I figured," she replied. "Thank you for letting me know." "You sure you didn't want to be here for it?" "I didn't need to see it," she said. "He knows what he did. That's enough." There was a pause. Then Charles said, "The DOJ's regional director is requesting you speak at the annual Law Enforcement Ethics Summit in D.C. They want your voice on policy reform." Monique looked out at the sky, orange from the fading sun. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said. But only if they're actually ready to listen. Back in Richmond, the city slowly began to breathe again. Internal Affairs reopened 5 old cases. 2 supervisors stepped down. The police chief released a revised code of conduct. Body cam policies were rewritten. And the community held a candlelight vigil, not for a victim, but for a turning point. The sign in front of the courthouse read, "You can't unsee the truth." And the woman who made that possible? She was already moving forward. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was a plain envelope, hand-addressed in crooked block letters, stamped from a federal detention facility in Virginia. No return name, no Department of Justice label, just the institutional number, and the unmistakable tone of someone trying to make peace with something they couldn't outrun. Monique recognized it instantly, though she hadn't expected it. She held it for a full minute before opening it, standing at her kitchen counter in a quiet townhouse just outside Jackson. The sun hadn't risen yet. Her tea sat cooling beside her laptop, which was already loaded with briefs from a new case. Life had moved forward. The world hadn't stopped when the trial ended. There were still systems to inspect, officers to interview, victims to hear. But the letter felt like a loose thread. She broke the seal and pulled the single page from the envelope. It was written in blue ink, slanted and heavy, like the pen had been pressed too hard. The handwriting was rough, the sentences uneven. There was no greeting, no "Dear Dr. Harris," just words starting in the middle, like a confession forced from a man who had spent most of his life pretending he was never wrong. "I don't know what I was thinking that day. I guess I thought you were just another one of them. Loud, entitled, looking to stir trouble. I didn't know you were with the DOJ. I didn't know you were important." Monique read the line again, slower this time. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out when it all turned. It wasn't just that kick. It was something else. I think maybe I knew, even before I touched you, that you weren't someone I could scare. That's what got me. That look on your face, like I wasn't even worth being angry at." She kept reading. "They talk about accountability a lot in here. In the programs, I mean. There's a counselor who asks us to say it out loud, to name what we did. I haven't done that yet. I don't know if I ever will. But I'm writing to you because I don't want you thinking I never thought about it. I do, every day. I see your face every time they open that cell, every time the lights flicker off at night." He hadn't signed the letter with "sorry" or "please forgive me." Instead, he'd scrawled his name at the bottom like a man used to filling out forms, not feelings. R. Denning. Monique folded the letter once and placed it back in the envelope. Then she tucked it into a brown folder marked closed cases and slid it into her file cabinet. She didn't need to respond. She didn't need to say anything at all. The letter wasn't for her, it was for him. A desperate attempt to claw at something redemptive. A gesture sent into the world with no real expectation of reply. He hadn't found peace. He just found a place to put his guilt. And she had work to do. That afternoon, Monique drove 2 hours to a community center in Vicksburg, where she was scheduled to lead a listening session with residents who had filed complaints against the local sheriff's department. They didn't know who she was, yet not really. They knew the headlines, the rumors, but what mattered to them was the same thing that had always mattered to her, being heard. When she walked in, the room went quiet. Some of them stood up, others clapped. One woman walked forward and took her hand, tears in her eyes. "You gave us all courage," she said, "even when you didn't say a word." Monique nodded, her voice low. "It was never about me. It was about making sure no one else had to feel alone in front of the system." The listening session lasted 4 hours. Stories poured out. Pain, fear, hope, generational wounds still open. Children who grew up afraid of sirens. Grandparents who had stopped believing in justice. She wrote every note herself. No assistants. No tape recorders. Just paper, pen, and undivided attention. When it ended, the room stayed full. No one wanted to leave. Monique stood by the door as each person filed out, offering thanks, quiet glances, nods of appreciation. A teenage boy lingered behind, maybe 15, wearing a worn hoodie and sneakers too small for his feet. He looked up at her and asked, "Do you think someone like me could ever be in charge one day?" Monique smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "but only if people like you refuse to stay quiet." That night, as she returned to her room and laid her files across the table, she thought about how far things had come and how far they still had to go. The system wasn't healed. The culture wasn't transformed, but something had shifted, because when the video had gone viral, when the headlines exploded, when the community had risen up not out of rage but out of resolve, it proved what Monique had always believed. Justice doesn't come from a courtroom alone. It comes from standing up, even when it hurts, from refusing to look away, from knowing who you are when someone tries to silence you, and from walking back into the fight the next morning, even if your ribs still ache. She closed her laptop and walked to the window, the night breeze soft against her face. In the drawer behind her sat a letter she'd never answer. Filed, finished, stamped, not with hate or regret, but with one simple word: closed. Because justice didn't need her to scream. It just needed her to stand up. And she did. As we grow older, we begin to understand that justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive in sirens or grand speeches. Sometimes, justice looks like a woman standing back up after being knocked down. It looks like choosing dignity over retaliation, truth over fear. This story reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing is not peace, it's surrender. And while we may no longer march in the streets or sit in courtrooms, our voice still matters. Our wisdom, our experience, and our courage to speak truth, especially when it's inconvenient, can shift the course of entire communities. The lesson here is simple but powerful. No one is above accountability, and no one is beneath dignity. Whether we are 16 or 76, standing firm in what is right sends ripples through time. It reminds us, and those who follow, that the measure of strength isn't how loud you shout, but how calmly you rise. Let us not forget, justice may be slow, but it always starts with someone refusing to stay silent. And sometimes, that someone looks just like us. If this story moved you, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who still believes in quiet strength and lasting justice.